picture this. A winter gala in one of the finest houses in Halifax, champagne in crystal glasses, 200 guests in their most deliberate finery, and at the center of it all, Viscount Harwell standing at the top of the grand staircase with a woman on his arm who was not his wife. Adeline stood 12 feet away, near the fireplace, holding a cup of mulled wine she had not touched. She had been his wife for 9 years. She had managed Thornfield Hall, written every letter of correspondence, memorized the preferences of every guest who had ever dined at their table. She had done it without complaint, without acknowledgement, without so much as a thank you from the man who had spent the better part of those 9 years looking through her as though she were a window and not a person. And tonight, Viscount Harwell raised his glass to the room and said the words that would travel through every parlor and dining room in Halifax society for the next decade. "Friends," he said. His voice carried the way a man's voice carries when he has never once doubted whether a room would listen. "There is someone I should like you all to know, someone who has been in my life for 3 years, and who, in every way that matters, is the true mistress of this house. Allow me to introduce Miss Celeste Orvaine." The woman beside him smiled. She had dark eyes and a red gown that had not been chosen carelessly. She was perhaps 25. She looked like someone who had decided, some years ago, to win, and had been doing so methodically ever since. 200 people held their breath, and Adeline Harwell set down her mulled wine on the mantelpiece very carefully, very quietly. She smoothed the front of her ivory gown. She turned toward her husband and the woman at his side. She walked across the room at exactly the pace of a woman who has somewhere better to be, and when she reached them, she extended her hand to Celeste Orvaine with a composure so complete that 3 people in her immediate vicinity later said they had mistaken it for warmth. "Miss Orvaine," Adeline said, "what a pleasure." She did not look at her husband. Not once. She collected her wrap from the footman in the entrance hall, stepped out into the December cold, and got into the waiting carriage before anyone in that room had properly exhaled. They would talk about it for years. They would say she didn't even flinch. They would say she walked out as though she had planned it, and the thing was, in a way she had. She just hadn't known she was planning it until it was already done. Adeline Harwell had been 19 years old when she married Viscount Harwell, born Charles Fairborn, before he inherited the title from a bachelor uncle. A man who had seemed at the time to be exactly the sort of person a young woman with good sense and careful parents might be grateful to marry. He was handsome and articulate and possessed of a social ease that made every room he entered feel like a performance everyone else was lucky to be part of. Her mother had cried at the wedding. Her aunt had squeezed her hands and said she was the luckiest girl in Nova Scotia. That was 9 years ago. She was 28 now, and she had spent the better part of those 9 years running a household that received regular praise from everyone except the man who lived in it. She rose at 6:30 each morning. She met with the housekeeper by 7. She reviewed the accounts, answered the correspondence, managed the tenant matters for the 2 farms attached to the estate, and planned every dinner, every reception, every charitable contribution the Harwell name had ever been associated with. She did it thoroughly and without drama, the way she did most things. Charles was not cruel. This was what she had told herself so many times it had begun to lose its shape. He was not cruel. He was simply absent in the way that mattered more than physical absence. He was warm to strangers. He was charming at dinner parties. He forgot what she said within the hour and looked at her across the table sometimes with an expression she could only describe as mildly surprised that she was still there. She had stopped asking where he went during his long trips to Montreal. She had stopped asking a great many things. Instead, she perfected the seating arrangements, for dinners where she was the only one who knew which guests could not be placed beside each other, and why. It was on a Wednesday in November, the sort of gray and uneventful Wednesday that Halifax produces in quantity, that she found the letter. She had gone into his study to retrieve a ledger he had borrowed 3 weeks ago and not returned. The letter had been folded inside it, tucked between 2 pages, slipping out when she lifted the book. She should not have read it. She read it. It was not long. It did not need to be. Charles, I've been watching the clock. Come back when you can. Always yours. See. Adeline stood in the study for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the housekeeper's boot heels moved across the kitchen floor in their familiar pattern. She folded the letter. She replaced it exactly where it had been. She picked up the ledger and walked out. She did not cry. She had suspected, in the way you suspect things you have chosen not to examine for quite some time. Suspicion confirmed is not surprise. It is something colder and more specific. The moment you understand that the careful life you have been building has been built on an agreement that only one party was honoring. She went to her writing room. She sat down. She wrote a letter to her father's solicitor, a man named Mr. Trowbridge, whom she had not contacted in 4 years and whom she trusted above nearly everyone she knew. She asked him a single question. She sealed the letter, rang for the maid, and sent it that afternoon. And then she went downstairs and hosted a dinner for 7 with such grace that 2 of the guests wrote to her afterward to say it had been the finest evening of the season. She was very good at this. She had been good at it for 9 years. But something had shifted. Something quiet and permanent. Adeline Harwell had stopped, without quite knowing it, building a life around her husband. She had started, without quite knowing it yet, building one of her own. The gala had been held at Thornfield Hall on the 15th of December, which was a date that would prove, in the way of certain dates, to be one that people remembered with unusual precision. She had not known what Charles intended. She had known only that he had asked her to arrange the evening herself, which was standard, and that he had mentioned, in passing, that Miss Orvaine would be attending, which he had said as though it were unremarkable, and which she had filed away with the care she applied to things that required quiet attention. She wore ivory. She always wore ivory. It had become the color people associated with her, composed, deliberate, the sort of woman who made a room run without anyone noticing the effort. The hall was warm and full when she arrived. 180 guests, plus 20 extras who had been added by Charles at the last moment, as he sometimes did. She had adjusted the seating arrangements without comment. That was what she did. She moved through the room in the way she always moved through rooms. Genuinely interested in people, genuinely curious, asking about their children and their parents, and the particular concerns of the year. She was not performing warmth. She had never had to perform it. It was perhaps the one thing in her life that had always been fully hers. She saw Celeste Orvaine from across the room and recognized her, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of a woman who notices everything. Beautiful. Deliberate. The way she stood near Charles carried a familiarity that had not been arranged for this evening. Always yours, see. And then Charles moved to the top of the staircase, and the room quieted, and he raised his glass, and said what he said. Adeline felt the entire room turn toward her before she had processed what was happening. That was the particular cruelty of a public humiliation like this one. It required a witness. It required the humiliated party to be present, to confirm by their reaction that something had occurred. In the 3 seconds she stood there, with 200 pairs of eyes on her face, she understood this completely. And then, something unexpected happened. The shock didn't collapse her. The humiliation rose and then receded, like cold water you have stepped into and then stepped out of. And what remained underneath was something cooler and much more useful. clarity. She had been building her life on a foundation she had not examined, and Charles had done her the considerable service of setting fire to it in public, so that there could be no returning to the comfortable pretense. Very well. She set down her mulled wine. She walked across the room. She shook Celeste Orvaine's hand with perfect composure and said, "What a pleasure," in a voice that did not shake. She did not look at Charles. She left, not quickly, not slowly, at exactly the pace of a woman who knows where she is going. She told the driver to take her to Glenmore House. Her mother's people had owned Glenmore House for 3 generations. It sat 14 miles north of Halifax, on a low hill above a frozen pond, surrounded by birch trees that went white in winter and looked, from a certain angle, like something out of a painting that had never quite been finished. It had been left to Adeline by her maternal grandmother in a bequest, written with a specificity that her grandmother, a woman of unusual foresight, had clearly intended. To Adeline Margaret Coverley, as she had been before she became a Viscountess. Not to the Harwell estate, not to her husband. To her. She had not stayed there in 3 years. She arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the gala, with a trunk, her personal-made patience, and a leather satchel containing everything that Mr. Trowbridge had sent her in the past 48 hours. There had been considerably more than she expected. The caretaker, an older man named Mr. Sessop, who had looked after the property in her absence with quiet competence, opened the door before the carriage stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the trunk. He asked no questions. "There's a fire laid in the sitting room," he said, "and Mrs. Sessop has put on soup." "Thank you," Adeline said. "That will do very well." The house smelled of wood smoke and the faint mineral cold of a building that has been properly heated in advance for someone expected. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment with her coat still on, and breathed and felt something she identified after a moment as stillness. Not silence, because the fire was going and the birch trees outside were moving in the wind. But stillness, the interior kind, the kind she had nearly forgotten the feeling of. She went to the desk in the sitting room, opened the leather satchel, and began to read. The letter she had sent to Mr. Trowbridge had asked a single question. What is mine? Not what she deserved, not what Charles might be convinced to offer. What was already, legally and without contest, hers. Mr. Trowbridge had replied with the thoroughness of a man who had been waiting 20 years for someone to ask him the right question. Glenmore House and its land, hers, unambiguously under the terms of her grandmother's bequest, structured in a way that placed it entirely outside the Harwell estate, a trust established by her grandfather on the occasion of her birth, generating steady income that Adeline had never touched and had, in the 9 years of her marriage, nearly forgotten existed. Her grandmother's jewelry, a small investment portfolio her mother had begun on her behalf at 21. She was not wealthy by the standards of Halifax society, but she was not, as she had half feared in the sleepless night after the gala, ruined. She was, in fact, something she had not been in 9 years, solvent, independent. The word landed in her chest like a stone in still water, and the rings it sent outward reached all the way to the edges. She picked up her pen. The first visitor came on the 3rd day. Her closest friend, Harriet, not in the list, she confirmed in her mind, no. She arrived in a carriage that was far too well appointed for the frozen lane, and stepped out with the particular composure of a woman who has made many decisions before 9 a.m. and intends to make several more before noon. She walked through the door of Glenmore House, looked at Adeline sitting at the desk surrounded by papers, and said, without preamble, "You look better than I have seen you look in 4 years." "Sit down," Adeline said. "Mrs. Sessop will bring tea." "Everyone is talking," her friend said, sitting. "I thought you should know, in case you weren't already aware, which I suspect you entirely were." "What are they saying?" that Charles has lost whatever sense he was born with, that the Orvaine woman is a disaster in a red gown, that your handshake was the most composed thing witnessed at a Halifax social event since the governor's reception in '89. A pause. And that you are either very strong or very damaged, and no one can quite work out which. How do I seem to you? Adeline asked. Her friend studied the papers on the desk, the straight posture, the absence of red eyes, or the particular hollowness that grief produces in a face it has inhabited for days. You seem very occupied. I am, Adeline said. Extraordinarily. She did not allow her friend, who was wise enough not to press, came back the following week. And she was not the only one. Women came to Glenmore House in the weeks that followed, some out of genuine affection, some out of curiosity, some guided by a half-formed instinct that something was happening at that house on the hill that was worth being near. A young woman barely 2 years married came to the door one afternoon and said simply, "I didn't know where else to go." Adeline brought her in and gave her tea, and listened without offering advice that wasn't asked for. And when she left, she seemed lighter than when she had arrived. Meanwhile, the papers on the desk multiplied. Mr. Trowbridge came twice in person, his briefcase full of documents he spread across the dining table while Mrs. Sessop pretended not to listen from the kitchen. He explained in his careful way the precise state of the Harwell finances. It was, he said, with considerable understatement, not what it appeared from the outside. How bad? Adeline asked. He looked at her over his reading glasses. In 32 years of practice, he had delivered a great deal of difficult news. He had not delivered it to anyone quite as composed as the woman across from him. The Viscount has been borrowing against the estate for approximately 5 years, he said. The amounts are significant. The lenders are becoming impatient. A pause. And Miss Orvaine's history prior to her current situation is also worth your attention. Adeline looked out the window at the birch trees. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the simplified version." Mr. Trowbridge reached into his briefcase and produced another folder, thicker than the first. He placed it on the table. "I was rather hoping you would say that," he said. She had known. Viscount Harwell was not a careful man with money. She had not known the extent of it. The picture that assembled itself across her dining table over the following days was considerably more than she had prepared for. He had made a series of investments 5 years ago, a shipping enterprise, a land venture in the West, all of which had performed badly. Rather than absorb the losses and reduce his expenditure, he had borrowed, and then borrowed again to cover the interest, and then, when that became unstable, had borrowed from people whose patience was not proportional to their discretion. And then there was Miss Orvaine. Celeste Orvaine had not always used that name. She had been born Celeste Perrin in a small town outside Quebec, the daughter of a shopkeeper. She was intelligent and striking and possessed of an extraordinary talent for moving through social circles, each one a step higher than the last, leaving behind her a trail of men who had found their situations considerably worse for her presence. The most recent, before Charles, had been a merchant in Toronto who had ended their association without his savings, his reputation, or, from what Mr. Trowbridge could determine, any clear understanding of how it had happened. Adeline read the file twice. Then she set it down and sat for a while in the quiet of the sitting room. She had expected to feel triumphant. What she felt instead was something closer to grief. For the years, for the man Charles might have been if he had ever tried to be that man. For the waste of it. She gave herself 20 minutes. Then she opened the satchel and went back to work. It began to unravel in February. The first crack appeared at a small reception at the home of a retired judge and his wife, where Celeste arrived with every expectation of being received as Charles's acknowledged companion. What she had not accounted for, because she had been less attentive than usual to the social currents of the past months, was that the judge's wife, a woman of 70 who had survived 3 provincial governments and had no particular use for diplomatic softening, was an old acquaintance of the Toronto merchant. She looked at Celeste across the room with the calm attention of a woman reviewing something she has already catalogued. "Miss Orvaine," she said, at a moment when the room was quiet enough that the words carried, "I wonder if you might settle something for me. I've been trying to recall, wasn't there some trouble a few years back in Toronto? Something to do with a business matter?" The room paused. Celeste smiled. "I don't believe I know what you're referring to. How curious." "He seems to recall you very well. It was a small thing, nothing provable. But Halifax society ran on exactly this kind of fuel, and by the following morning, the question had spread and attached itself to other questions that had been quietly gathering in every drawing room since December. Who is she, really? Where does she come from? And what precisely happened in Toronto? Charles heard the whispers. He went to Celeste with what he had heard, and she was warm and plausible and reassuring, and he believed her for approximately 5 days. Then a letter arrived from his primary creditor requesting an urgent meeting within 30 days, or the matter would be referred to legal counsel. He read it 3 times. He poured himself a drink. He poured himself another. And then he did what men in his position often do when they have run out of moves. He told Celeste about it, because she was the only person he had thought to tell, and then he registered, with a cold clarity he had not expected, that this was a condition he had arranged for himself. Celeste listened. She took his hand. She looked at him with those dark eyes and said there was a man she knew, a shipping investor from Montreal, very wealthy, who had expressed interest in being introduced through the right channels. Charles looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. "You want me to introduce you," he said slowly, "to a wealthy investor." "I want us to solve this together," she said. He thought about the merchant in Toronto. He thought about Adeline standing in the entrance hall of Glenmore House in a plain wool coat, looking at him as though he were a problem she had already solved and set aside. He thought about what it had cost her to shake Celeste's hand that night, and what it had taken, and what kind of person could do that, and why he had never quite understood until now what kind of person she actually was. He had several drinks, and the next morning he sent a note to Glenmore House. It was not an apology. He was not yet capable of an apology. He was working toward it in the painful way a man works toward something he does not entirely want to reach. Because reaching it means looking at what he has done without the usual buffer of pride. The note said, "Adeline, I think we should speak properly. I'll come when it suits you." Adeline read it at her desk. She set it down. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote back in her clear, even hand, "Come on Wednesday, send word ahead. I'll have Mrs. Sassop prepare lunch." He arrived on Wednesday. He had sent word ahead. This, she noted, was already a departure from his usual mode. He looked older. Not the gradual older that years produce, but the sudden kind that consequences do. Something had gone from him, that particular ease, that unthinking confidence that had always filled the rooms he walked into. It was still present but turned down low, like a lamp on a dimmer. "You look well," he said, looking around Glenmore House with the expression of a man trying to comprehend something that resisted comprehension. The sitting room was small and well-ordered, and smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and the particular warmth of a house that is actually lived in rather than maintained. "I am well," Adeline said. "Come in. Lunch is nearly ready." They sat across from each other at the dining table. Outside, a chickadee was conducting urgent business in the birch trees. The fire was warm. The house was the way Thornfield Hall, with its 14 rooms and its constantly staffed corridors, had never quite managed to be genuinely comfortable. Not grand, just itself. "I've made errors," Charles said. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed and is now delivering in a register he has decided is most likely to be effective. Authority first. Confession second. With the estate. With certain decisions. I am not in a position to. Things are more complicated than they appear. Yes, Adeline said. I know. He looked up sharply. What do you know? Enough. Mr. Trowbridge is thorough. Something complicated moved through his expression, shame and offensiveness arriving simultaneously and briefly contesting for the foreground. Shame won, narrowly. You've been looking into my finances. I've been understanding my own situation, Adeline said, with the evenness she had worked hard to achieve. Not coldness, evenness, which required understanding yours. I should have done it years ago. He was quiet. Outside, the chickadee moved on. I want you to come back to Thornfield, he said. There it was. Adeline had not known it was coming. Why? She asked. He blinked. What? Why do you want me to come back? I'd like to understand what you mean by it. He had not prepared for this question. He had prepared for refusal, for conditions, for the negotiation of terms. He had not prepared for a woman who simply wanted to understand his reasoning. Because you're my wife, he said. I am. Adeline agreed. I have been for 9 years, while you were otherwise occupied. The fact of it doesn't seem sufficient on its own. What would be different? He looked at the table, at his hands, at something that had no particular location. I don't know, he said finally. And it was the most honest thing he had said to her in 9 years. She heard it the way you hear something unguarded, with a recognition that has no comfortable home to go to. That's the most truthful answer you've given me since we married, she said quietly. He made his offer, eventually. Practical, not romantic, at least consistent with the man she had always known. She would return and resume her position. The ton would accept it. They would accept whatever Adeline put her name to. That much was clear. The creditors could be managed if the estate presented a stable front. Miss Orvaine, he said, was resolving herself. He would be present. He used the word deliberately, as though he had found it in a dictionary and was testing its weight. Adeline listened to all of it. She gave him the full attention of a woman who has learned, recently, and at some cost, what it means to actually hear something. Then she said, No, not harshly, not with triumph. Simply no. I won't go back to Thornfield. Not on those terms, and not on any terms that look like the last 9 years. I won't do it, Charles. Not because I want to punish you. I don't. Punishment is exhausting and I have better things to do with my time, but because going back to what we had would be dishonest, and I've used up my entire supply of dishonesty. I haven't any left. He stared at her. Then what do you want? I don't want anything from you. The simplicity of it landed in the room like a stone. That's rather the point. I have what I need. I have this house, and my grandmother's trust, and my own mind, which turns out to be quite a good one when given the chance to work properly. I don't need you to give me anything. I need you to understand that. He sat across from her and looked for the first time she could remember genuinely lost, not in the social way, that mild bafflement he had sometimes deployed as charm, genuinely uncertain, genuinely without a move. She felt for him then, not love or not the love that had been there at 19, which had been real and had deserved better than what it received. Something human and unavoidable. He was a man who had built himself entirely on surfaces, and the surfaces had gone, and underneath was someone who had never been asked to figure out what was underneath. What happens to us? He asked. I don't know yet, Adeline said, but whatever it is, it will be honest. That's more than we've had in quite a long time. He was waiting for his carriage in the drive when she saw, from the sitting-room window, a figure coming along the path from the north. A man she recognized. Not well, because they had only spoken twice, both times at large gatherings where the setting had made real conversation impossible. He was her neighbor to the north. A man named Whitmore who managed his own property with a quiet competence that people in the county mentioned when listing things that worked, without drawing attention to themselves. He had the look of someone who had come to return a borrowed fence post tool and had perhaps timed his arrival rather less accidentally than the situation implied. The two men acknowledged each other briefly in the drive. She could not hear what was said, but she watched Charles look back at the house, at the warm-lit window, at her, with the expression of a man beginning to understand, slowly and too late, the full dimensions of what he had thrown away. Not the wife, not even the marriage, the specific, particular, irreplaceable woman who had been standing right in front of him for 9 years while he looked past her. His carriage came. He got in without further exchange. Adeline opened the door before the neighbor had knocked. "I saw," she said. "Come in." Mrs. Sessop made shortbread this morning. He came in. His name was Nicholas Whitmore. He had been widowed 4 years ago, managed 800 acres to the north, and had a way of saying exactly what he meant without announcing that he was about to do so. She had noticed this about him the 2 times they had spoken. It was, she had thought, a rare and underrated quality. They sat in the sitting room with the fire going and the shortbread between them. "He's going to contest this," Whitmore said eventually. Not a prediction, an observation offered without alarm. "I know," Adeline said. "Are you all right?" She considered the question properly, not the reflexive perfectly fine, thank you of 9 years of managed composure, but the actual answer found by actually looking. "Yes," she said. "I rather think I am." He looked at her in the firelight in a way that was entirely different from the way anyone had looked at her in a very long time. Not at the Viscountess, not at the managed surface. At Adeline. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I was at the Harwell summer reception 3 years ago. The one at Thornfield. In July, I remember it. I spoke to you for perhaps 8 minutes, near the garden door, about the elm disease that had been moving through the county that summer. You knew more about it than I did. I went home that evening thinking I had met the most interesting person at the party, which I thought was a notable thing because the party included the Deputy Minister of Agriculture." Adeline looked at the fire. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I've been your neighbor for 2 months, and your friend for 1, he said, "and I find I am running out of patience with not being honest about things. I'm not telling you to do anything with it. I simply wanted you to know that someone noticed you before all of this." Someone saw. The fire crackled. Outside, the birch trees were dark against a sky that had gone the particular deep blue of a maritime winter evening just before full dark. Adeline felt something shift in her chest. Not the dramatic, all-at-once kind, the quieter kind, the kind that has been very still for a long time and doesn't make a great deal of noise when it moves. "Nicholas," she said. "Yes, ask me to dinner properly next week." He looked at her, and something arrived in his expression that she suspected had been waiting there for some time. "Miss Coverley," he said, her name before her real name, the one her grandmother had written into the bequest. "Would you do me the honor of dining with me next Friday?" "I would," she said. "Thank you for asking properly. Does it matter so much?" "More than most people think," she said. Celeste Orvaine made her final miscalculation on a Tuesday in March. She was, above all things, a woman who moved toward opportunity. It was the quality that had carried her from a shopkeeper's household in rural Quebec to the finest drawing rooms in Halifax, and it had served her exceptionally well for a long time. The difficulty, with always moving toward the next thing, is that it does not pause to assess whether the terrain has changed. Celeste had not been assessing. She had been occupied with the deteriorating situation at Thornfield and had not attended carefully enough to the social weather. The next opportunity, in March, was a widower from Montreal. Very wealthy. Newly arrived in Halifax for the spring season. She found him at a concert evening, positioned herself with the easy expertise of practice, and within an hour he was laughing at her observations and asking whether she would be at the Drummond dinner the following week. What she did not know was that the Drummond dinner was being hosted by the same retired judge's wife who had asked, in February, about Toronto. She had spent the past 6 weeks gathering information, through old acquaintances, through professional contacts, through one very productive conversation with Mr. Trowbridge about matters that did not pertain to Adeline's affairs. And she was entirely ready. At the dinner, the Montrealer mentioned to his hostess that he had met a most interesting woman. The hostess poured more tea. She set down the pot, and then she told him, in precise and unhurried terms, exactly what she had learned about Celeste Orvaine over the past 6 weeks. She did not embellish. She simply presented the facts, in order, with documentation available on request. He did not seek out Celeste at the next gathering. He did not explain his absence. He simply disappeared from her horizon in the way that wealthy men disappear when they have been warned in time, cleanly, without drama, without a forwarding address. Celeste noticed, she made inquiries, she received no satisfactory answers. It was the first time in a very long time that she felt the ground shift. She went to Charles on a Wednesday morning. He was in his study at Thornfield, reading a letter from his creditors with the expression of a man reading a sentence he had written himself and cannot appeal. "I'm going to Montreal," she said. He stared at her. "I know people there," she said. "Opportunities that suit me better than the current situation." Something crossed her face that might, in different circumstances, have been regret. "I think we both know this has run its course." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Adeline at the dining table in Glenmore House, asking him why he wanted her to return, asking what would be different, giving his answers the weight of genuine questions as though his reasoning actually mattered. He thought about what it had taken her to ask that, and what it said about her, and what it said about him that he had never once in 9 years asked her a question that required a real answer. "Goodbye, Celeste," he said. She left. He sat alone in his study with the creditor's letter and the full, unobstructed view of the past 4 years. What he had chosen, what he had allowed, what he had destroyed, and for what. He poured a drink. He set it down without touching it. He picked up a sheet of paper and began to write. The letter arrived at Glenmore House on a Friday. The same day Adeline returned from her first dinner at Nicholas Whitmore's property to the north. She found it on the hall table with the Morning Post and recognized Charles's handwriting. She opened it at her desk. It was 3 pages. His handwriting, usually controlled, ran slightly uneven in places, the writing of a man who had been pressing hard on the pen because stopping would mean not finishing, and he had to finish. He did not make excuses. She read the relevant section twice to make sure she had not missed them. He had not. He described, instead, what he had done, what he had seen and chosen not to see, what he had taken for granted in a way he laid out, with the specificity of a man who had been making himself look at the thing properly, without flinching, before putting pen to paper. He said he was sorry. He said he knew it was inadequate. He said he was saying it anyway, because she deserved to hear it, even if it changed nothing, and he was finished placing his own comfort above what she deserved. And then there was this line, which Adeline read 3 times, sitting at her desk in the quiet of Glenmore House with the February morning light coming through the window, and the birch trees moving in the wind outside. "I think I have loved you in my own inadequate and completely insufficient way for a very long time, without understanding what love actually required of me. I understand now. It required everything I withheld. I am sorry I learned it at this cost." She set the letter down. She sat with it. She did not cry, though she had thought she might, had prepared for it, felt the possibility of it. What arrived instead was quieter. Something like the sound a door makes when it closes properly, not slammed, not locked, simply shut, on a room she had lived in for 9 years and was now, at last, leaving properly. She folded the letter. She placed it in the top drawer of her desk, not the bottom one. The top one, where she kept things she intended to keep. She did not write back that day. The separation agreement arrived from Mr. Trowbridge on the following Monday, with a cover letter of 2 sentences. Adeline read the document at the dining table with the thoroughness she gave to everything now. Separate maintenance, separate residence, full control of her own property and finances, freedom, in every sense that mattered practically, without the near impossibility of a formal divorce. All it needed was her signature. She sat at the table for a while. She could hear Nicholas outside. He had come that morning to look at the drainage along the north boundary, a problem she had mentioned in passing, and he had arrived with a spade and his estate manager, and had been quietly useful for 2 hours, and had not asked to be thanked for it. She could hear him in the yard, his voice and the estate manager's, easy and purposeful. She picked up the pen. She put it down. She stood up and went to the window. "Nicholas," she called. He appeared from around the corner of the house, looking up, patient, present. "Come inside," she said. "I need to think out loud, and Mrs. Cessop has made shortbread again." He came inside. She told him about the document. She told him what signing it would mean, and what it would close, and what it would open. He listened the way he always listened, with his full attention, without preparing his response, without steering her toward any particular conclusion. "What are you uncertain about?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, after a moment. "I think I was waiting to be certain I was certain." "Are you?" "Yes," she said. She signed it the next morning, not ceremonially, not dramatically. She sat down after breakfast, read every page with the attention it deserved, picked up her pen, and signed her name in a clear, even hand. Adeline Margaret Coverley, as she had been, as she still was underneath everything that had been layered on top. She sent it to Mr. Trowbridge with a short note. Then she put on her coat and went out to walk the perimeter of the property in the thin March sun, through the birch trees and down to the pond, which was beginning to show the first thin signs of thaw at its edges. She stood at the edge for a while, doing nothing except being there. Then she went back inside and got to work. What she heard, through her friend who remained her most reliable source on Halifax society, was that Charles had received the signed agreement without contest and had subsequently done something that surprised people who knew him. He had engaged a new solicitor, dismissed 2 of his household staff he did not need, and sold the western parcel of Thornfield land to a neighboring farmer at a fair price rather than to speculators at a higher one. He had, her friend reported with barely concealed astonishment, been seen meeting personally with his largest creditor, not through intermediaries, but himself. "He looks older," her friend said, on a visit in April. "I mean that constructively. He looks like a man who has stopped relying on things that don't hold." "He'll be all right," Adeline said, and she meant it. Not as generosity, not as performance. As genuine assessment. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had never been asked to be a good one in any way that cost him something, and he was learning, late and at significant expense, what that actually involved. And then spring came. The birch trees came back first, as they always did. The particular yellow-green of new birch leaves against a sky that had finally decided to be blue again. The pond thawed fully in the first week of April. The kitchen garden, which Mr. Cessop had maintained in careful readiness, came to life with the reliable determination of things that have been tended properly and are waiting for the right conditions. Nicholas asked her to marry him on a morning in late May, standing at the edge of the pond with the birch trees behind him, and the light doing what late light does in Nova Scotia, when it remembers that it is capable of being magnificent. He asked her the way he did everything, directly, without theater, In his own words, he told her he loved her. He told her what he meant by it. Specifically, in detail, the way a man says something he has been paying attention to rather than constructing. He said he knew her situation was complicated and her independence was hard, won, and he would never ask her to compromise it. He was asking her to add to it if she would like. He was asking for a partner, in the full sense of the word. Someone on her side, not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. Adeline stood at the edge of the pond and looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 19, and the wedding, and the absolute certainty she had felt walking up that aisle that she was the luckiest woman in Nova Scotia. She thought about what luck actually was, whether it was circumstances or whether it was something else, a quality of attention, of honesty, of willingness to keep working when working was hard. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." They were married in September, small, quiet, exactly themselves, the house and the property and the people who actually mattered, which turned out to be fewer than Adeline had spent 9 years trying to impress, and more than she had feared in the hardest nights at Thornfield, when the silence had felt like a verdict on her worth. Her friend wept throughout the ceremony and claimed afterward that she had not. Mr. Trowbridge attended with the expression of a man who has completed a piece of work he is satisfied with. Mrs. Sessup made a cake that was discussed in the county for the remainder of the year. On a morning in October, just over 2 years after she had stepped out of Thornfield Hall into the December cold and told the driver to take her north, Adeline Whitmore sat at her desk in Glenmore House and looked out at the birch trees. They had gone gold. They did that every October, and every October it was, she thought, worth paying attention to. Nicholas was somewhere on the property. He was always somewhere on the property, doing something useful, and the sound of his occasional movement through the yard had become one of the ordinary sounds of a life she had built in the way she wanted it. Built, deliberately, honestly, with full knowledge of what she was choosing. She had started, 6 months ago, a small reading group for women in the county. Not a formal school, not yet, though she was thinking about it, every other Thursday in the sitting room, with good tea and whatever books people were willing to bring. It had begun with 5 women and was now 11. 2 of them had told her, in private, that it was talked about something that was fully theirs, dos. She had understood exactly what they meant. Mr. Trowbridge had written last week about a potential expansion of her grandfather's trust. She needed to look at the numbers. Nicholas had opinions about the north drainage that she wanted to hear. Her friend was coming next week. The birch trees outside had perhaps another 2 weeks of gold before they let go for winter. She picked up her pen. She thought about what she would say if the women in her reading group asked her someday how she had gotten from that December gala to this October desk. She thought she would say this: "I did not leave to punish him. I left because I had spent 9 years building a life around someone else's comfort and had nearly convinced myself that this was the whole of what I was for. I left to find out who I was without the performance, without the management, without the role I had been playing so long I had forgotten it was a role. It took time. It took a good solicitor and a stubborn old house on a hill and birch trees that went gold every October whether you were watching or not. But I found her, and it turns out she had been there the whole time, waiting with considerable patience to be asked." She put down the pen. Outside, the birch trees moved in the October wind, sending a few more leaves into the yard. Somewhere on the property, a door opened and closed. Nicholas, returning from the north boundary. In the top drawer of her desk, unfolded and accessible, not put away, was the letter from Charles. She had kept it not as a wound and not as a record of damage. She had kept it because she believed and still believed that honesty costs something, and that when someone pays it even late, it counts. The world is large enough to hold both What was broken and what was built from the breaking. She reached for Mr. Trowbridge's letter about the trust and began to read. The birch trees held their gold a little longer than she had expected. They always did.